Regional Water Quality Impairment Assessment. We have John Cassani here with the Calusa Waterkeeper. And the purpose is to review of the regional impairment assessment by the Calusa Waterkeeper issued last March. The report summarizes water quality impairments in 9 counties using FDEP assessment criteria. And this relates to water quality improvement priority areas. So you're on. Yes, it's live.
Thanks, Deb. Appreciate it. Always good to be here and see all the great outreach programs with CHNEP. It's really good to see it. I work for a nonprofit organization. Clean water is our mission, and we're a little bit of a citizen science as well to some extent. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about impairment in the 9-county region. Next slide. And just again, by way of introduction, I work for a Waterkeeper Alliance member organization. My title is Calusa Waterkeeper, and that's also the name of our organization. There are about 14 waterkeepers in Florida, and we have one of the larger project areas in the state. Next slide. And so we have Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee River, Greater Charlotte Harbor. So we have about, excluding the watershed areas, we have about 1,000 square miles of water in our project area. But it is one perhaps linked hydrologic element in the regional system. Next slide. So a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about in the context of our growing concerns about water quality impairment in the region. And this kind of started with some discussions we were having with the Technical Advisory Committee back in 2017. I'll give you a little intro to that. It was kind of a chronological lead in, and then we'll talk a little bit about a summary of our water quality impairment status and trends report that we put out in March of this year. And then maybe discuss a little bit about where we might or should be going in terms of trying to stem the rate of water quality impairment in the region. Next slide. So back in 2017, our concern about water quality impairment was growing. And I think what concerned us most at that time was that some of the outstanding Florida waters, including some of the state aquatic preserves, were becoming verified impaired, particularly for nutrient enrichment. And Matlacha Pass was designated impaired in 2015. So Matlacha Pass is a Class 3, predominantly marine water body in the state. And kind of felt like, wow, we really need to understand more about why our highest value waters are becoming impaired. So in 2017, I made a presentation to the Technical Advisory Committee, and I was basically pushing Matlacha Pass for TMDL development back then. And members of the committee and staff are going, well, it's not the only OFW impaired in the study area. So long story short, we had a little charrette with FDEP and the Technical Advisory Committee, and looked a little deeper into just how much of the OFWs, how many and where are they impaired and for what parameters are they impaired for. And that resulted in a letter from the CHNEP to the department indicating the problem. And there were very specific priorities that CHNEP had established for TMDL developments. And we picked those kind of focused on nutrient impairment, and those that were outstanding Florida waters is sort of our priority here. Next slide. So this was the letter. It seems like ages ago, but it was just 2017, just 4 years ago. Seems much longer ago. And your executive director, Jennifer Hecker, signed this letter, and it represented a consensus from the TAC and the policy committee in determining these priorities for TMDL development. Next slide. Some of the excerpts from the letter was kind of doubling down on the CCMP and that, doing these nutrient reduction plans and BMAPs, et cetera, were important. Implementing, not just seeing new TMDLs development, but to implement restoration programs where they're required through the regulatory process. And then again, the CHMP's priority action is to reduce non-point source pollution, which is primarily what we're talking about, primarily what's driving the impairment in these outstanding Florida waters. Next slide. So kind of the results of the study or the review by staff was that there are 88 outstanding Florida water WBIDs or water bodies or water body segments in the CHMP study area. That kind of surprised me. I had no idea there were that many. 46% or nearly half in 2017 were impaired for fecal indicator bacteria and 27% impaired for nutrients. So that was kind of a wake-up call that, wow, impairment is significant in the region, particularly for our outstanding Florida waters. Next slide. Also part of the letter was the prioritization that the TAC and the policy committee had come up with in terms of what would be the priorities. So it was those water bodies, those OFWs that were impaired for nutrients, and kind of the priority process resulted in 5 estuaries that were the priority. I was happy to see Matlacha Pass at the top up there, followed by Lemon Bay, Donna Bay, Roberts Bay, and Blackburn Bay. Again, all verified impaired for nutrient pollution. Next slide. So as part of the charrette back in 2017, we learned a little bit more about the TMDL priority process. So in addition to the traditional TMDL development process, there's things called stakeholder-driven plans, sometimes called a 4B or 4E plan. So that was one of the options for addressing this problem. The other was a type of TMDL called a Categorical Tmdl. And what that does, it enables stakeholders to petition a particular water body for TMDL development as a priority. So we kind of thought the letter was our petition to the department in the context of prioritizing TMDLs. We hope they thought of it that way. And then again, TMDLs can be developed through legislative priority. And that's what happened essentially with the Caloosahatchee estuary in 2009. So local stakeholders, primarily local government, had petitioned the legislature to start a TMDL, and that happened pretty quickly with that kind of support. Next slide. So since we've had this concern and this greater understanding of how the process of restoration works for impaired water bodies, I wanted to understand how much progress we were making. And so I went to the department's TMDL and BMAP region of the state for Southwest Florida. And I was able to determine to the best that I could that there's been no TMDLs developed in the CHMP study area since 2010. So basically we've seen more high value waters verified impaired for nutrients, but we're not seeing TMDLs developed to keep pace with that process. Next slide. The other part of this kind of Lake Wobegon story is that another very important state aquatic reserve, that being Estero Bay, that was the state's first state aquatic reserve, was designated verified impaired for nutrients in 2019. So this kind of followed on the sequence of impairments we saw also for the OFW tributaries to Estero Bay. So really a concerning problem. Again, our highest value resources, coastal resources, being designated impaired for nutrients. And so I think we all kind of know the scenario when you see over-enrichment of nutrients, we begin to see a shift in primary productivity, sometimes from plant species that adapt or respond more quickly to nutrient enrichment, like macroalgae or epiphytic algae that competes with macrophytes such as seagrass. And so seagrass is such an important ecosystem component to these estuaries that we were really concerned that this might become a growing problem. And as it turned out, we're beginning to see some very significant downward trends in seagrass in both Estero Bay and Mount Shade Pass. So that's kind of the bad news manifestation of nutrient overenrichment. And of course, we see sort of an ecosystem cascade event when you see primary production start to change like that. So it has an effect on the fishery, some of the higher trophic levels, which is very concerning. Next slide. So we tried to get a little bit of a better handle on just how this impairment problem is manifesting in the 9-county region. You see the little motif of the state, and those are the 9 counties from Collier to the south, to Pinellas and at the north sector there. And we picked 2 inland counties, Hendry and Glades. So our project area includes Charlotte, Lee, Hendry, and Glades, and we thought, well, we just stick to that project area, but we thought, well, there are some interesting and significant similarities in this larger 9-county region, which was the underlying reason we chose this larger subset to look at. Next slide. So we took a pretty conservative approach to trying to understand how we would quantify and look at impairment. And so we worked essentially off the state's comprehensive verified list of impairments for 2018, 19, and 2020. And then we teased out the data for individual counties, which enabled us to do some inter-county comparisons. Again, we thought this was kind of a conservative approach because when a water body becomes verified impaired, it's gone through all the filters and quality assurance steps that you need to know that there's an absolute anthropomorphic cause to the impairment. And so we kind of stuck with that subset. You should understand that the category 5 or high value or the high priority impairments are a relatively small subset of the total. So on the study list, there's a long list of WIBIDs that have an impairment assessment result, but they may be lacking one little metric that enables them to get to that verified. So we think using the verified was a conservative way to go. So we were looking at the 9 counties in this context and how these different metrics might apply to the different kind of parameters that become verified impaired. We also thought that 7 of the 9 counties, which were the coastal counties, had a number of common denominators, like they had similar meteorology. They were all categorized in zone 4, relevant to stormwater management. They all had urban land use as a significant element of the landscape. They all had a westerly flowing river terminating in a Gulf of Mexico estuary. And they all represented water bodies in basin groups 1 to 3, which during our assessment period, 2018 to 2020, had all finalized their 5-year assessments that had been adopted by secretarial order. So those were kind of the common denominators to the coastal counties that we thought was important to point out for comparability. Next slide. So people say, well, what were your underlying reasons? What did you think the outcomes would be? And so we thought doing this on a county or geopolitical basis was relevant or valid, because most of the restoration programs involve local governments or regional governments for restoration. And they also involve most of the key stakeholders in BMAPs and the MS4 stormwater permitting programs. So looking at it from a county perspective, we thought had value in that context. Understanding the factors or metrics that drive water quality decline. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a second, in terms of what we used and how we assessed it. And then we thought updating the summary on an annual basis as new information becomes available on impairment through the comprehensive statewide list would help us track progress toward restoration, success, and accountability among stakeholders. Next slide. So the study we did, I think you can download it from our website, calusawaterkeeper.org. It's a little bit on the technical side, and there's an introduction to how impairment is assessed by FDEP, how water quality is assessed that leads to this verified impairment category. So I'd encourage you to look at that, and if you're interested and want to dig in on it to understand it a little more comprehensively, how impairment's determined. So the first part of the report was to look at county demographics and land area. And we thought an important one, and I'm just giving you little snippets of each of these 4 segments of the report for brevity. So this one was percent population increase during that 3-year period. You can see some of the faster growing counties, should be no surprise. Lee, Collier, Manatee, very rapidly growing. And we found that these percent increases we list here were actually conservative. They were less than what was determined after the 2020 census. That data came out after we'd published this report. So consider this conservative. Next slide. I forgot to mention also too that, for example, Lee County is not just fast growing in the context of Southwest Florida, which is a fast growing region, but Lee County is the 5th fastest growing county in the entire country. And we think this is a strong link to why we're seeing such an increase in the rate of impairment. Growth is a causality factor in many contexts leading to this problem of impairment. So for example, Lee County showed a 36% increase in impaired WIBAs between 2018 and 2020 as one example. Collier County wasn't too far behind, and then you have Charlotte and Manatee up there, sort of in the mid-range. Next slide. Okay, so go back just one, Nicole. Maybe I meant, no, sorry. Next slide, you got it. So one of the other metrics we looked at was percent increase in developed and impervious area. And this came from NOAA's Coastal Change Assessment Program, very valuable assessment document full of good information on these important metrics that lead to impairment. But it was only available, the data was only available 2001 to 2016. Nonetheless, we thought it was a good introduction to what might have been leading to impairment starting in 2018. So we thought we'd include this anyway. And it was no surprise what we were seeing. Faster growing counties had the highest increase in percent development and percent increase in impervious area. So I think anybody that's kind of tracked watershed science over the years knows that when a basin or a watershed at any level, once it reaches about 10% impervious, we start to see urban stream water quality decline. Once you get up into the 30 and 40% impervious, then BMPs don't really work very well at that point. So just some context to the developed area, impervious area. Next slide. Another metric we looked at was percent land area in agriculture up to the year 2016. You can see the 2 inland counties, no surprise, Hendry and Glades, were heavily dominated by agriculture. And Manatee was relatively high too. That was kind of a surprise to us. So Manatee had both urban and a significant element of agricultural land use. Next slide. The third part of the assessment was to look at individual counties where we were summarizing the degree of impairment for 4 or 5 parameters. They were fecal bacteria, nutrients, metals, dissolved oxygen. And on some of these, there was a minor 5th category related to a narrative criteria for a biological component. So for example, these 2 counties, Collier and Glades, were heavily dominated by nutrient pollution. Next slide. For example, Manatee and Hillsborough were heavily dominated by fecal bacteria impairment. Not that they didn't have other problems with other parameters, but the predominance of impaired WIBAs within these 2 counties was for fecal bacteria. Next slide. So the last part of the study, we got kind of creative, I guess, and we decided, well, let's apply these top, you can see across the top row, 6 metrics we use to rank the 9 counties. So we ranked each individual county for each metric, and then we averaged the ranks for each county across each row to get an average rank, and that was used to determine a final rank. So a rank of 1 would represent a county that's moving most rapidly towards more impairment. A county that would rank 9 or 10 would be one that's moving perhaps less quickly towards an increased rate of impairment. So some of these counties like Pinellas, very small county, urban county, had reached probably build out or near build out already. So they really couldn't get much worse in terms of the percentage area impaired. But we thought it was, we kind of smoothed out some of the variations by using this ranking process. So if a county ranked 1 for a particular parameter and low for all the others, then it would, correspondingly rank lower. And so we'll go over the rank here in just a second. Next slide. So to summarize, looking at this from kind of a high altitude assessment, urban population growth and associated development underlie impairment causality in most coastal counties in this 9 county subset. Okay, this is not just a Southwest Florida problem. For parameters like fecal bacteria and nutrient impairment, in 2010, there were about 1,050 miles of rivers and streams in Florida impaired for fecal bacteria. That became 8,000 miles by 2020 in just a 10-year period. So we're seeing drastic increases in the number and the rate of impairment for some of these parameters like fecal bacteria and nutrients. Some of the top county impairment rankings per metric, if you look at population increase, we kind of went over these already a little bit, but Lee, Manatee, Collier leading the way on rapid growth. The percent of total WIBIDs impaired was an interesting metric. The 2 agricultural counties led the way on the percent of all WIBIDs within a county impaired. Lee came in 3rd, not too surprisingly. And the percent increase in development and Impervious was kind of led by Manatee, which was interesting. So when you see these kind of more general rankings, you can kind of go back, look at some of the specific activities, some of the specific sources within these counties that are contributing to this impairment. And that's going to help with the restoration, guiding the restoration in the future. Obviously, the most frequently occurring impairment parameter in 6 of the 9 counties was fecal bacteria, which has become widespread statewide now. Nutrients represented the highest proportion of impaired WIBIDs in 3 counties, Collier, Glades, and Hendry. And then you can read the rank from highest to lowest, starting with Manatee to Pinellas in the overall ranking category, moving more rapidly towards an increased rate of impairment. Next slide. So the takeaways are that water quality restoration, unfortunately, is lagging behind the growing list and rate of impairments, particularly here in Southwest Florida. And we think growth is driving that trend. Unfortunately, no TMDLs that we can determine have been developed by FDEP in the CHNAP study area since 2010. So we want to see that change. We sent them our priority list in 2017. We haven't seen any action on new TMDLs developed since then. The other part of that equation is that TMDLs and BMAPs are a regulatory mechanism, but I wouldn't put all my stock in TMDLs and BMAPs, which sounds a little contradictory because we're seeing areas like in Lee County has 2 BMAPs for nutrients, but Lee County demonstrated the highest rate of increase in nutrient impairment since 2018, which is somewhat counterintuitive or contradictory. And we're not just talking about Lee County government, we're talking about all the entities within Lee County, the municipalities including unincorporated Lee County, just to make that clear. The really sad conclusion is outstanding Florida waters represent a high proportion of waters impaired and continue to increase. Again, outstanding Florida waters are protected by statute in Florida that entitles them to the most protection that we can provide to protect these waters from declining further. So the missing link here is linking these statutory requirements to local land development codes, comprehensive plans. These are the things that are driving the disconnect between how we want to protect these waters versus how we actually do it. So I think that's the last slide. I may have gone too long. But
No, go ahead.
Yeah,
This is really important.
Yeah, you've got time.
So again, I guess this is the part that maybe we should have started with potential remedies. I don't think this is new information to too many folks, especially if you've lived here for the last decade or so. We think maybe the best way to approach this is through improved stormwater permitting, non-point source stormwater permitting through the MS4 program. That's the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System Programs, which is an MPDES, Clean Water Act delegated authority to the state of Florida. And so compliance needs to emphasize monitoring more rather than, depending on presumed progress from projects, where progress is defined by load, a formula for load reduction as a result of a specific project. It just doesn't seem to be working very well. The other thing that's going on in the background is some of these basins are experiencing extremely rapid growth that's interfering with some of the progress for the restoration. So it's kind of one step forward with projects, but a step and a half back perhaps with the added growth that is adding more pollution during the concurrent time period we're trying to restore these water bodies. We're going to need the state and regional water management districts to step up more on terms of developing TMDLs quicker and implementing BMAPs with more realistic criteria. So the governor has, issued an executive order in January 2019. BMAPs, looking at BMAPs, effectiveness was on that piece of legislation that we now call the Clean Waterways Act, Senate Bill 712. And so the legislators trying to navigate through what meaningful change means for BMAPs. Maybe I should just let that go there, but it is an interesting process and I encourage you to follow it. And local governments, I think where we're going to see our best bet for actual restoration is through local governments that, are developing sustainable future land use plans that get a handle on how growth is impacting the receiving waters in these jurisdictions. And considering some of these stakeholder-driven alternative TMDLs, excuse me, like the 4E alternative might be the way to go. So just some sort of high altitude thinking about what directions might we want to go in terms of kind of reforming where we've come from and where we want to go. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.